He found her high up on a large patch of scrubland. She had walked across a platform of last year's brambles which spanned a small ditch, become stuck and rolled to one side. She remained forlornly waiting to be rescued, 2 of her legs dangling between the branches, the others in the air. If he hadn't found her, she would have died. Once she had been cast, she couldn't have righted herself, and the gases building up in her rumen would have eventually cut off the blood supply, firstly to her legs, and then to other parts of her body. For all that, she wasn't completely stupid. Sybil trusted him absolutely, and stayed perfectly still while he leaned over her to release her fleece and lift her out. Once she was freed, Amos stood astride the animal, talking softly to her as he rubbed her limbs to bring the sensation back. When he finally let her go, she walked unsteadily at first, but then broke into a trot which quickly became a run to join the rest of the flock. Bess had wandered away as Amos set about his rescue. A minute or 2 later she began to bark. With slippery Sybil on her way back to the rest of the flock, Amos set off down the hill. Bess was still barking. He shouted a command, and although the dog stopped for a second or 2, she refused to obey. Instead, she cocked her head on one side and began barking again. It was then that he noticed the magpies. There were several on the ground and a couple in the branches of a tree looking on. What did you call a gathering of magpies? He'd read it somewhere, but he couldn't quite recall. A congregation of magpies? Or was it a murder of magpies? The thought of murder made him feel uneasy. Bess seemed to be keeping them away from something. She was an intelligent animal, and Amos felt obliged to return and see what was troubling her. As he drew near, Amos heard a reedy cry. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been working on Sussex sheep country for years. He knew the downs like the back of his hand. He was familiar with the sights and sounds of animals in the night, like a hen harrier swooping down on a foraging field mouse, the call of a vixen, the smell of a fox's lair, or the cry of an owl. Pathetic as it was, this wasn't the usual cry of any animal that he'd come across, whether in distress or otherwise. Bess was still staring into the thicket, her flanks shivering, when Amos crouched down and, looking under the hedge, spotted a tiny arm. "Dear Lord alive," he murmured. "It's a baby." He parted the foliage to get a better look. She was naked, but she lay on a dirty piece of yellow-edged blanket. Her skin was blue with the cold, and she still had her umbilical cord. The placenta was beside her. Tugging at the blanket, Amos got her into a better position, and whipping off his shepherd's waterproof cape, he wrapped it around her tiny body. Her cry was getting weaker all the time, as feeble as a kitten's meow. He knew he had to get her to a place of safety, and quickly. Because he often had days on his own, Amos had become a man who loved reading. Years ago, he'd read in a book how the Eastern shepherd who lived at the time of Christ had a pocket on the inside of his cloak. At lambing time, he would put any sickly or orphan lamb inside that pocket, where the warmth of his own body would help it survive until he could tend to it properly. Amos had been so impressed with the idea that he'd persuaded his wife to make just such a pocket on the inside of his own coat. He'd had little opportunity to use it, but now he gently pushed the baby, still wrapped in her blanket, into its folds and tied his belt underneath her so that she wouldn't be swung about as he walked. As he hurried down the hill, the birds descended on the bloody placenta, greedy and fighting. His mind was in a whirl. Who could have done such a terrible thing? It was obvious the perpetrator didn't want the child to survive, else he or she would have put her somewhere where she was bound to be found. Amos felt sure it couldn't have been the mother. For starters, it was highly unlikely that she could have